Welcome so much, everyone, to this webinar, Healing Trauma Through the Body. So let's just take a moment to get settled. You could be sitting in a chair, perhaps you're at your desk, or you could sit on the floor or stand in a comfortable position. But perhaps just taking a moment to tend to your body as we begin this session. So you might have some water nearby or a pillow or a chair to sit on, and just adjusting yourself so that you're relatively comfortable. And we could begin with a short grounding exercise. So your eyes could be opened or closed. And you're welcome just to begin to notice the ground underneath you. So you might do this by looking down and noticing the floor, right? So whether you're in a building or in a car or wherever you are, just noticing the surface underneath you. Maybe there's a chair. You could begin to rock a little bit side to side, right to left to right. Maybe just sensing the ground. Right. And if you close your eyes or look away, perhaps getting curious, is there any clue that the ground is there? Any sensation? Any pressure? You could also move forward and back. Perhaps noticing that you're breathing. Another option might be to stretch your arms up overhead any amount. Again, your eyes could be open or closed. Perhaps noticing your hands, your fingertips. You could stretch up or to the sides. Maybe noticing that you're breathing for 3, for 2, and for 1. And then bringing your hands perhaps to your lap or together. You're welcome to bow forward any amount. Perhaps acknowledging yourself for being here, acknowledging that you have arrived and chosen to carve out this time in your life, in your day, to try something new and learn about healing trauma through the body. I deeply honor each one of you for being here. Thank you and welcome. Okay, so if your eyes are closed, you're welcome to open your eyes and take a look at the screen. If you are joining through the phone and you do not have a visual, that's okay. I will email you a copy of the slides afterwards so you can see them. And for now, you can listen, and I will have some visual slides coming up, but you should be able to understand everything just through hearing it as well. So I'm gonna just dive right in and just first give you an overview of this next hour. So this call will end at noon in 1 hour. And so I have a slideshow for you that presents my training and the background, where this information is coming from, and goes through the theoretical pillars of the method that I work with. Then we'll have some time to do an actual practice session, and that you'll be able to do from right where you are. You don't need anything fancy or a mat or any special clothing. It'll be pretty minimal movement. And then we'll have time for Q&A, questions, and answers at the end. So that's kind of the arc of our time together. And I'll dive into the slideshow. So let me see. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So, all right, hopefully you can see that. And so the title of this webinar is Healing Trauma Through Embodiment. And first, I just wanted to introduce myself and where I got my training and where I got all this information. So my influences are mainly, for the purposes of this talk, come from the Trauma Center, Trauma Sensitive Yoga facilitation training that I went through. And so I have been teaching this method specifically for 4 years and completed my training in 2015. I was one of the first cohorts to go through the advanced certification in Trauma Center, Trauma Sensitive Yoga. And that's where I got my perspective on trauma specifically. Before that, I had already been teaching yoga since 2009, and I was trained in Hatha, forest yoga, restorative, and prenatal yoga, and have a lot of training in yoga and movement in general. I also am influenced by some graduate studies in depth psychology and certification in expressive arts therapy and my own personal healing journey. So I'm also a complex trauma survivor, and I have used embodiment practices to heal my own trauma. And it's an ongoing thing. It's not like I was wounded and now I'm healed and I'm teaching others. It's a constant process. And for me, beginning to teach this and engage with other survivors is a part of my own healing path. And so I really like to share that with folks at the very beginning, so that you know what my motivation is. My motivation to do this work is really to give back, and because this has been such a huge part of my journey. And I think it's very natural to want to give back and keep going when something has been this helpful and transformative. So that's my background, so you know where this information is coming from. So what is TCTSY? This is an interesting name. It stands for Trauma Center, Trauma Sensitive Yoga. And it is actually an evidence-based adjunctive clinical treatment for complex trauma or chronic treatment-resistant PTSD. So we'll talk in a little bit about what those diagnoses mean, what those words mean. But what's really interesting about this method and what sets it apart from a lot of other yoga methods is that TCTSY has a clinical foundation, right? It was created by clinical researchers at the Trauma Center. And so it does have foundations in trauma theory, attachment theory, and neuroscience, which are all kind of areas in the realm of psychology, in the field of psychology. It also was co-created by a yoga teacher named David Emerson, who had a background in Hatha Yoga practice and in the study of yoga. So it does have an emphasis on body-based forms and breathing practices. I personally don't call my classes yoga because we don't read any of the scriptures. We don't go into a lot of the dharma or the lineage of yoga. And so in order to respect yoga as a practice that does have a cultural and very specific ancient lineage, I call my classes Healing Trauma Through Movement, because what we're doing, as you'll see when we experiment with it, is just some basic movements through our bodies. And so for me, it doesn't actually represent or honor the lineage of yoga to the extent that I think it's appropriate to call it that. So that's my personal choice, but the training is called Trauma Center, Trauma Sensitive Yoga. So I'm an adjunctive faculty at the Center for Trauma and Embodiment and have been certified through that program to use the protocol developed and studied and empirically validated there. So the theoretical underpinnings of Trauma Center, Trauma Sensitive Yoga are neuroscience, trauma theory, and attachment theory. They're all founded in the field of psychology. And so we'll go into more details about these underpinnings in a moment. But first, perhaps we could just discuss what is the impact of trauma, right? So here's a few things that can happen when you experience trauma. So my definition of trauma is anything that's so overwhelming that that it's unbearable, that a split occurs in order to protect yourself. So if you think about having a terrifying or overwhelming experience, and this could be, I get the question all the time, like, what type of thing do you need to experience in order to have trauma? Do I have the right type of trauma? What if it was more psychological and not physical? And what's really interesting, what I've learned through my studies, is that it's not so much about what happened to you or what the story is of your trauma. It's more about the impact that it has on your system. And so two people could have the same experience. One person might experience that as traumatic, and the other person might not, just depending on their window of tolerance, depending on their history, depending on their body's reaction. And so that's really helpful to remember. But if it was overwhelmingly terrifying for you for whatever reason, a neurological split occurs in the brain to protect you. And so that actually can cause long-term effects that I'll go into later. So there's a neurological impact to trauma. This can result in difficulty making choices, difficulty knowing what you want, difficulty with boundaries, difficulty saying no, saying yes, a lot of things around choices. Difficulty being in the present moment, having a case of like, I can't stand this, I just want to get out of my life, I just can't stand this at all. So that can lead to a lot of other patterns like addiction or eating disorders or self-harm, anything to get out of the unbearable present moment. Dissociation, challenge to feel the body. So dissociation could be experienced as being very distant from your body, not feeling a lot of sensations at all, or it could be experienced as an overwhelming amount of sensations that's hard to organize and figure out. Then all of these things, when you're having difficulty being present, making choices, feeling your body, that really can impact your relationship to yourself, right? It can be hard to be with yourself, to tolerate that connection. And it can also be really difficult to be in relationship with others. And so these are just some of the symptoms, some of the impact that trauma can have long-term on survivors. So I get the question a lot, like, do I have the right type of trauma? Who is this for? Who is this method for? And I just want to share some recent research about, oh no, there's a typo here, but it should say PTSD, not PTSD. That's post-traumatic stress disorder. And the other side is a new diagnosis called complex PTSD. And so for a very long time, PTSD has been the only trauma-related diagnosis in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, that is used in the United States by clinicians. And so what is PTSD? It was a diagnosis written in the 1970s to reflect the experience mainly of Vietnam War veterans coming back. And it is characterized by some core fear symptoms that I listed here. So avoidance, re-experiencing, and hyperarousal. So the kind of portrait of PTSD you could think of as, it used to be called shell shock. So these are very physical embodied symptoms, avoiding places that remind you of the traumatic memory, avoiding people, avoiding confronting these traumatic reminders or triggers. Then re-experiencing could come in the form of nightmares, intrusive thoughts, and flashbacks. Hyperarousal is like feeling on edge or keyed up all the time, feeling like jumping at a loud sound, being on alert, going very easily into a state of emergency or overwhelm. So all of these kind of characterize PTSD, which originally was thought to have a single source incident to cause it, right? So, okay, the time that the bomb went off caused my PTSD. Then in the 1980s, a woman named Judith Herman wrote a book called Trauma and Recovery that talks a lot about how trauma is not only something experienced by male war veterans, but it's also experienced by women and children and other people in the home. And how what causes trauma can be relational, it can be complicated. It's not necessarily the one time you got in a car accident. Maybe it's your entire childhood. Maybe it's this 10-year relationship you were in. Maybe it is a repeated experience of sexual assault. And maybe there was some childhood abuse, and then later on in your adult life, there was a different form of trauma. And so it's complicated and layered, and it actually does build up over time to create a new and unique set of symptoms. And so actually this year, 2018, it's published in the ICD, the International Diagnostic Statistic Manual, for the first time ever. And so this is a brand new diagnosis, although it has existed forever as a phenomenon. So the interesting thing about complex trauma is that it includes all the core fear symptoms of PTSD, and in addition to that, it includes some core self-organization symptoms, which are affect dysregulation. So that means, affect means emotion. So basically, going really easily into intense or extreme emotions. That could be up into the hyperarousal zone or down into despair or freeze state or depression. Core negative self-concept. So this is like really low self-esteem, finding it hard to find a will to live often, feeling like a shell of a human, feeling like the scum at the bottom of the pond, feeling like the gum under someone's shoe. These are words I've heard a lot from survivors, just this very low sense of self-esteem. And then interpersonal disturbances, so challenges in relationship, challenges in relating to self and others. So that's complex trauma, and it's super complicated, and it's also common. And so especially for people who experience any type of systemic oppression or institutionalized trauma, that is also a form or a cause potentially of complex trauma. So the treatment goals of trauma-centered, trauma-sensitive yoga are to engage the interoceptive pathways of the brain, rewire the brain. So this aspect is based on neuroscience research. Another goal is empowerment, right? This is based on trauma theory to help us get our agency back, get control back in our bodies and in our lives, building self-esteem, and also to rebuild and strengthen our relationships with ourselves and other people. So hopefully you can kind of see how the treatment goals kind of mirror the symptoms, right? So I will touch on each of these in a little bit more depth and connect them to the practice that we do in our bodies. So the first treatment goal is interoception. And this is a word that I actually didn't know until I began to study this. But the word interoception means basically noticing sensation in your body. So what is sensation, right? I could use the word feeling, like, do you feel anything? What do you feel here? But I like to use the word sensation because feeling could mean, oh, I feel happy, I feel sad. And sensation is just the physical layer, right? So we could practice it just right now if you want. Maybe noticing your hands, right? So you could look at your hands. Okay, noticing that I have two hands, right? And then what if you look away from your hands or bring your hands out of your vision, maybe closing your eyes or just looking away? Is there any clue that you have hands? Any sensation there? You could tap them together. Yeah, like for me, I feel like the texture on the back of my hand is a little bit smoother, and then the front of my hand is more moist, more textured. I feel the like grooves in my palms. They're kind of warm. In the backs of my hands, my fingertips are more cold. Okay, so that just short little practice right there is interoception. And so even if you couldn't feel a lot of sensation, even if it felt kind of numb or if it was difficult to notice, even getting curious about your hands is the practice of interoception. So another way I like to talk about it is it's a practice of curiosity, becoming curious about your body and engaging with your body. And it's very different from judgment, right? Instead of saying, oh, my hands are so stupid, they're too hot or they're too rough or whatever. Just like, oh, interesting. There's some roughness there. Oh, I'm noticing my hands are hot. And so part of the practice of interoception is engaging the neural networks, and another part of it is practicing curiosity, which is the opposite of judgment. So in terms of the neuroscience, I'm not a neuroscientist, but if we break it down in a very simple, overly simplified way, you could think of the brain as having three parts, right? The prefrontal cortex, this is our, cognitive, conscious part, the medial cortex, and then the brainstem. And so the medial cortex, this middle section of the brain, it houses your limbic system, which is your emotional brain, and it also is the part of your brain that tells you that you have a body. It's a part of your brain that tells you that you exist. It sends you those signals to notice the sensation, to do interoception. So in order to interocept, the middle of your brain needs to be online. It needs to be connected. But in a moment of trauma, when you're feeling that fear and overwhelm, a neurological split occurs. So it actually, on a physical level, splits the medial cortex from the prefrontal cortex. And there's less connection there. And that's so helpful in the moment, because in a moment of fear, danger, attack, it's helpful not to feel your body. It's helpful not to feel your emotions. It's helpful to dissociate, for it could save your life. So you might have had an experience, I've had an experience of being in a traumatic moment and coming out of my body and looking and seeing my body from above, completely dissociating. It's helpful. You don't feel the pain of the moment. There's other more subtle ways to dissociate as well. But the problem comes when months or years later, you're still experiencing that sense of separation from your body. That could become very painful and problematic. Because if you can't feel your body, how do you know what you want to eat for lunch? How do you know if you want this person to hug you or not? How do you know if you're in pain, if your body's signaling you to sit in a different way, right? So part of if you're experiencing chronic dissociation, that there is a physiological foundation for that. And what's really helpful for me, it was really helpful for me to know, okay, this is my brain doing this. It's not my fault. It's not because I'm stupid. Because the physical impact of neural splitting is dissociation, but the emotional impact is I'm not getting the signal that I exist. And so essentially, emotionally, it can really lead to that low self-esteem, like, wow, do I even exist? Should I exist? This can lead to suicidal ideation, like, maybe not. I feel empty. I feel hollow. I feel worthless. And so that sense of low self-esteem actually has a physical component. And for me, it was so empowering to realize I don't need to look at myself in the mirror and convince myself of these affirmations that are totally unconvincing, right? I can just notice my body and build self-esteem in that way. Because every time you interocept, every time you notice, like, oh, I do exist, I do have hands, oh, I'm curious about my existence, I'm curious about my body, it rewires your brain to groove that path. I exist, I have a body, I take up space in the world. So no matter what your thoughts are or how low your self-esteem, this practice can help build up a very strong pattern of I exist. And so before we get to I love my body or my body's a resource, we really start with I have a body. So that's the first treatment goal. I have a body. All right, so the second one is empowerment. This is based on trauma theory, and the understanding, which I know personally very well, that people who are traumatized have experienced a power imbalance in which choice was taken away from them. So we all have different trauma stories, and actually for this practice, it's not really important to know exactly what happened or what the story is. For a lot of people, if it's childhood stuff, maybe you don't even remember. Maybe the body is just having reactions. So stories can get very complicated and confusing. And so one thing that unites us all is having something terrible happen to your body that you were not in control of, right? So that unites the person who was pulled out in a riptide to the person who was sexually assaulted to the person who was at war in Iraq. Something happening, some experience in your body of terror, of overwhelm, unbearable, that you didn't have control over. Nobody would ever choose to go through an experience like that, right? And so the long-term impact of having that choice taken away can be a loss of self-esteem, a loss of self-trust. Like, wait a minute, why didn't my body keep me safe? How is it that that could happen? Because trauma is essentially the experience of living through something that shouldn't happen, probably, that oftentimes is not fair, is not just, does not make sense, is not okay, right? Is unbearable, is harmful, is all these terrible things, and yet it happened, right? So how do you reconcile that? How do you reconcile, oh my gosh, in that moment my body didn't keep me safe, like the terrible thing happened anyways. And so this can lead to a lot of negative self-thoughts and disconnection from the body, and like, oh, my body isn't trustworthy, it doesn't function well, I feel broken, I feel like a failure, I can't do anything. And so how do we build a sense of self-esteem, of empowerment and trust that's not just all fluff? Because trauma survivors have a sixth sense for BS, right? If you've survived through things this challenging, you have developed a sense of like your BS meter for survival. And so we're talking about starting from the foundation, from the ground up, from the very inside out. The last thing I want to do as a facilitator for trauma survivors is take your power away or tell you what to do or control your body. And it's tricky. It's interesting because in most movement classes and in most classes in general where there's a teacher and a student dynamic, there are instructions, there are rules, there's a right and wrong way to do it. And so that sets up a potential for failure. And so the way that I work with that is to share power. My goal as a facilitator is to share my power with you. So I'm not taking power over or judging or correcting. So we all do the practice together, and you'll see when we do it in a moment. But we all do the practice together, myself included. And as we go, I don't use any commands. So you could try this with me if you want, just noticing the difference. So here's how I was actually trained to teach yoga and how a lot of movement classes and classes in general are taught. Inhale, arms up. Exhale, hands down. Inhale through your nose, arms up. Exhale through your mouth, arms down. Keep going for 5, inhaling, arms up. For 4, exhale, arms down. For 3, inhale, arms up. Push. For 2, exhale, arms down. And for 1, reaching up. Exhale, hands to your heart. Okay? That's typical. Here's how I might do it in a trauma-sensitive context with invitational language. Okay. As you're ready, you're welcome to move your arms, right? You can move your arms up or down. It's your choice. Right? You're in control of your arms. You could reach your arms all the way up overhead, or it could be a smaller movement. You can choose the pacing and the size of your movement for 5. Maybe noticing your breath for 4. Your eyes could be open or closed for 3. Just experimenting with the arm movement for 2. And for 1. As you're ready, you're welcome to let your arms come down. Okay. So did you notice a difference there between the tone, or did it feel different to experience that? Um, Making choices can become very difficult for trauma survivors because of that lack of practice. So it's something that we're practicing. So just like we're practicing, oh, I have a body, building that neural pathway, we're also practicing the pathway of, oh, I'm not stuck. Like, there are possibilities for me. I hear so many times from the people I work with, like, I feel stuck, I feel trapped, I feel like I don't have any options. Everything becomes very black and white, very narrow. And so part of the empowerment piece is opening up, taking the blinders off and realizing, what options do I have, right? And not only are we practicing making choices, but we're practicing making choices in the context of our bodies. Like, oh, is that painful? Like, is there a way I could do this in a way that's more comfortable, right? We can get so used to living in discomfort or pain. And so specifically, we're practicing making choices like that are kind, compassionate, and that bring more ease into our bodies and our experience in our bodies. So that's a piece around empowerment. And I'll just say one more thing about it is that making choices can be challenging for folks who have experienced that choice being taken away. And so the last thing I want to do is set up another experience of failure. And so I dose the choices. So the first class we do is just, a couple choices, right and left or up and down, right? And then as we go, the choices get more complex. So we build our tolerance and our capacity to make choices at a pace that allows for a lot of experiences of like, oh, I can do this, right? Yeah. So if interoception is noticing the sensation of hunger, empowerment is realizing I'm hungry and I can feed myself. I have the capacity. Then the third is relationships. So I talked about how relationships can become impacted. Of course, if you're having a hard time noticing that you exist or noticing your body, and if you're feeling disempowered, like your choice has been taken away, then of course it's going to be really difficult to trust yourself and trust other people and orient to relationships which are founded on trust and communication. A lot of communication happens through our bodies. So there's some things that we say in words, and then there's a lot that we communicate with each other through mirror neurons, through our bodies responding and reflecting to each other non-verbally. So one thing I love, love, love about this practice and about my work is that essentially it's an opportunity for us to come together, all of us survivors, myself included, with our bodies and do something together that is hopefully not traumatic. Hopefully it's not re-traumatizing. So even just the act of signing up for something called trauma healing through movement, right? And then physically bringing your body into that space. Even what you're doing right now, signing up for a webinar with this title, bringing your body into this online space. It's very meaningful to be here together, to share space. And so for some folks, going to a typical yoga class might be very triggering or traumatizing. It might be re-traumatizing. It might bring up a lot of these insecurities or fears or issues. For other people, a regular class would be fine, and they also just want to come specifically for their trauma. So, there's a range of people who I work with, but some of the things that can be triggering in a typical yoga space might be mirrors, right? Going into self-critique. Opening doors, like could someone come out from behind the door, like bright lights or low lights, right? The teacher can sometimes be pacing around the room and they might put their hands on you at any moment without warning, and that can be very intense. Sometimes there's no consent, and then there's physical touch happening from the teacher in the classroom setting. And so what I do is I try to take all of that just out of the equation. There's always a variety of people who might respond differently to different stimulus, but in terms of creating a safe enough space to practice in, just eliminate. So there's no mirrors, all the doors are closed. The space that I work in doesn't have a front desk, it doesn't have a boutique, it doesn't have a Pilates class down the hallway. There's no like corporate or competitive or like intense environment. I used to teach at a studio that did have that, and it was problematic. And so the space that I teach in is a more of a therapeutic space that's healing. The doors all close. It's within a gate, within a garden. It's beautiful. It's simple. There's no deities. There's no altars. There's no mirrors. It's contained. And so the physical space has a lot to do with creating safety. And while it might not be possible to create a safe space, because this is also challenging, right? It's going to bring up discomfort, it's going to bring up growing edges and challenges, and that's good. But hopefully it's safe enough to keep coming back and trying new things and learning together. And so that's the third part. It has a lot to do with the environment. One more thing about the environment is that the groups I work with are closed groups. And so once you sign up for a course with me, it's the same people coming back again and again. So you don't have to spend your energy like tracking the room for new people or tracking the room for me walking around. I stay on my mat the whole time. You can see me the whole time. Everybody's against a wall. There's a wall behind you. No one's going to come up behind you and touch you. And you can just rest assured knowing that you're sovereign on your mat. You can do what you want. And so that's very important to me to provide that level of predictability, safety, consistency, and containment for this work so that hopefully you can stop leaking your precious energy into assessing your safety as much and put that energy and attention towards noticing your body and making choices, which is what we're there to do. Okay, so that's the third part. And yeah, so here is the class structure of the classes I offer. I often get questions about this, so I just wanted to let you know up front that they are closed groups. They are 4 to 10 weeks long, and they're open to cis women, trans women, and gender non-binary people. I don't have cisgendered men in the classes, also because for women and genderqueer folks, sometimes that can also be a trigger. And I do have referrals if men are looking to do some work that's similar. The classes I offer are in person in Berkeley, and I also do teach online via Skype and also have an online course. But the in-person classes are essentially an hour and a half long, and 1 hour of that is the movement practice, and then half an hour is a discussion of the different themes. So we use the book Overcoming Trauma Through Yoga by David Emerson, and actually, if you're curious about this method, I really recommend this book because it goes through the entire method. It's very easy to read, easy to follow, and we have optional reading assignments for each week. We discuss the theme of the week. Themes like interoception, making choices, taking effective action, finding your center, breathing. And we go through the different themes, and I love that part because during the discussions, we don't go into anyone's trauma story. It's not a talk therapy class, but it is really, really powerful to be in a space with other survivors, and we talk about our embodied experience. So instead of centering around the story, we center around, okay, what do you notice in your body this week? And people are always like, oh, I'm so shocked that this is working. I was just in the BART station getting anxious, and then I heard this voice, like, maybe notice your feet. And I started to ground, and I started to notice my feet. Or, so these practices, it's like taking a dose of medicine, right, for an hour and a half every week, coming and bringing your body into a space where you're practicing noticing you exist, noticing you have choices. So when the trauma responses rise up and you're feeling stuck, feeling trapped, you're going into hyperarousal or you're going into freeze, you might be more likely to be like, oh, I'm not stuck. Like, oh, what options do I have? Oh, I'm maybe noticing my body. maybe using my body as a resource. And so that's what can happen. That's what can happen in these classes. It's like opening up a gap, a space, so that you're less reactive when the trauma arises and more responsive, right? Your body will just begin to do it, and it's a bottom-up approach, right? So it's very different than talk therapy. It's not a replacement for talk therapy, but it's an adjunctive treatment. So talk therapy is top-down. It's cognitive, right? You're using your cognitive brain. For this method, it's bottom-up. So we're working with the more unconscious parts of the brain. And so I hear all the time from students being like, I'm so surprised this is helping. Like, how is this working? And that's why we do the theory part. So you know why we're doing everything. There's a reason for everything. It's very clear. But it's shocking. It's shocking for a lot of people that it works. Because it works on a physical level. You'll just find yourself noticing your body more often. You'll find yourself noticing your options more often. You'll find yourself noticing your breath more often. Yeah, so that's how the class works. And all right, so this is just a brief description of the upcoming classes I have. I have a summer series, privates. There's an introductory workshop next Monday and an online series next fall. I'll email this to you so you don't have to remember. And you can learn more through my website. All right, so that is all the info. And now let's do a little sample practice. So you can stay wherever you are, seated or standing. And maybe just taking a moment to notice the ground underneath you, right? So you might notice your feet. You might notice your seat connected to the chair. And just shifting a little bit side to side. Right to left, left to right. Your eyes could be open or closed. Yeah, perhaps just noticing that you're breathing. If you've been sitting this whole time and you want to stand up, you can do that. I'm going to stand up. You're not stuck, so you can always change your position, change your stance. Yeah. Okay. Just using this connection to the ground as a way to transition away from our talking, kind of intellectual portion into noticing your body, into interoception. Yeah. And from here, we could go into some ankle rolls. So if you're standing, you could begin to roll your ankle. And if you want to balance, you could bring your hand to the wall. Or it's kind of rolling your ankle. If you're seated, you can stretch your leg forward and roll your ankle. You're in control of the size of this movement and the pace of the movement. Maybe going the other way. For 5, and for 4, for 3, for 2, and for 1. We bring that foot down, and perhaps noticing here, is there a difference between the two sides? Right? Did that ankle roll have an effect? My foot that I just rolled feels a little bit more connected to the floor. You might notice what you sense. Okay. And then maybe coming to the other side. So again, you could use the wall for balance if you're standing, or balance on one leg, then roll your other ankle. Yeah, you can go in either direction. You're in control of the size of the movement. You're in control of the pace of the movement. Rolling your ankle, maybe going the other way. Is there any sensation there? Right? Anything you notice? I feel a little sensation in the top of my foot, like a stretch. And then eventually bringing both feet down. Perhaps pausing for a moment to notice, was there any effect? Right? You notice anything in your feet after that? Okay. And then we can move on to the knees. So if you're standing, you could bend your knees and just begin to move them in a circular motion, right? If you're sitting down, you can do the same thing, just moving your knees in a circle. You're in control of the size of the circle and also the pace of your movement, right? So if there's any pain in your knee, one option might be to make the movement a little smaller, right? So what might be the most kind way to do this movement? You can go the other way, right? What might be the most comfortable or easeful way to do this movement? For 3, for 2, and for 1. Okay, and now moving on to our hips. So for the hip movement, you can begin to move your hips side to side, right to left to right. If you're standing, you could bend your knees, or if your legs a little more straight. And if you're sitting, you can just rock kind of your weight from one hip to the other, going side to side on your chair. Yeah. Is there any sensation here? I feel a little, I'm noticing like a little stretch in the sides of my hips here. A little bit in my low back. Yeah. Another way you might move your hips is in a circular way. Yeah. Sometimes I share what I'm noticing, the sensations that I'm noticing, and you might notice something similar or different. Right? We're all different. You're welcome to notice that you're breathing. Maybe going the other way. For 5. If you're not stuck, you can always change the size of your circle. For 4. Eyes could be open or closed. For 3. For 2. And for 1. And then coming back. All right. So is there any effect on your legs from that? Right. So you could move your arms. You could reach your arms up overhead or out to the sides. You can choose the size of your arm movement. Maybe adding a little breath and moving your arms. Right, so you can control the size of the movement. Yeah, maybe rolling your shoulders. So you can roll them back or forward. There's 2 ways to move your shoulders, right? So you can try one direction, you could try the other direction. You're welcome to change whatever you want. You could roll both shoulders at the same time or one at a time, right? So you might experiment. Same time or one at a time. Maybe trying the other way. You might add the elbows into your movement, right? Experimenting with the size of the movement. You could also extend your arms, right? Maybe reaching through your fingertips. Maybe noticing that you're breathing, adding a little breath for 3. You can choose your arm movements for 2. And for 1. Okay, so let's come into some head and neck movements. So from wherever you are, you could turn your head side to side, right to left, left to right. You breathe through your nose or your mouth. Eyes can be open or closed. Perhaps noticing your range of motion. Like, is it easier to turn to one side or the other? Yeah. For me, I feel kind of a stretch when I turn to the right, but less sensation when I turn to the left. Yeah. You could also look up and down, ceiling to floor. And another option is to roll your ear from one shoulder to the other. Maybe breathing, noticing that you're breathing. Ooh, I feel a stretch right here in my neck. You might notice where you feel any sensation here. Moving your neck for 3, for 2, and for 1. Okay, and then coming back to center. Maybe sensing your feet on the ground. We could seal our short little mini practice today with a gesture. So perhaps turning your palms up in a gesture of acceptance, welcoming any benefits. And then reach your arms up overhead any amount. Bring them down through the midline, sealing the practice. You're welcome to do that 1 or 2 more times. Sealing the practice for now. You can release your hands or bring them together, perhaps bowing forward any amount. And acknowledging yourself for choosing to dedicate time and attention to your body, for having the courage to try something new. I deeply honor each one of you. Thank you. Okay, so that is a little sample of the practice. And yeah, hopefully that can give you a sense of what it feels like in your body. So you might take a moment right now just to notice the effect. And in the hour-long class, we do about half of the time standing and half of the time sitting. And there's not a lot of up and down. So we do the first portion standing, and then we come down to the floor. So I'm going to open it up for questions and answers. If you have any questions, you're welcome to type them into the chat box on the right-hand side. Or I'm going to unmute you in a moment, and you can speak. So here we go. Anyone have any questions or curiosities about anything that I shared? You can go ahead and share it out loud or type it in. No questions? All right. Well, I guess it was thorough in my presentation, and I really appreciate you all being here today and dedicating your time and attention to learning more about this method. And so I will just share one more time how you could work with me, or if you want to learn more, some resources for learning more. And so, let's see. All right, so I have some upcoming classes, and I have a summer series that begins on June 19th. It is a 4-week mini series, and all right, let's see. All right, it's a 4-week mini series that begins in 2 weeks. So if you wanted to join me in person, this class is at the Berkeley Yoga Center in Berkeley, California, and it's just 4 weeks. So because it's summer and people are traveling, I broke it up into shorter series. I normally do 10-week series because the study that this method is based on was 10 weeks. And so there is some evidence that shows that after 10 weeks, you could experience some results. So in the study, it was, I think, about 30 women who went through a 10-week trial of the TCTSY method for 1 hour per week. And then there was another group who did a women's health group class. And all of these people who did the study had treatment-resistant PTSD, meaning they had been in talk therapy for a minimum of 2 years, but it was closer to 10. for most of them without showing any significant signs of decrease in their symptoms. And then after doing 10 weeks of the yoga intervention, they showed an average 35% decrease in their PTSD symptoms according to the PTSD scale. And so that's why I do 10-week series normally, because that length of time has been proven effective. And so just like anything, I think it's best, it's a practice. So it's like really helpful to do it all the time, ongoing in your life, like therapy. For people I work with, there's an introductory series where we go through all the core themes and you learn the theory behind the practice, the reason behind the practice, and can really hone your skills in making choices, noticing sensations, and really ingrain these core basic themes. Then once you do the 10-week series, you can continue to do the practice on a weekly basis just to upkeep that maintenance in terms of rewiring your brain and growing the sense of empowerment, embodiment in your life and in relationships. So if you want just like a little sample, this summer we're going to be doing a 4-week mini-series starting in June, where we'll do the themes experiencing the present moment, making choices, taking effective action, and creating rhythms. Or there's another 4-week series in August where we'll do building curiosity, breathing, grounding, and finding your center. So you can do June or August, or you can combine them both for 8 weeks. And if you want to try it out, if you want to do a longer practice in person, I'm doing an introductory workshop next Monday from 6:30 to 8. So there will be another introductory lecture similar to what I shared, and then we'll do a longer practice. So you can come see the space in person. You can try it out in your body, meet me in person. If you want to come to a live workshop, that'll be next Monday. And then this fall, I'm coming out with an online series. I'm really excited because I've done an online series I think 4 times through Zoom. So you see how this technology is. And this is the first time I'll be having it professionally filmed, and it'll be available in the fall. I also offer privates in person in Berkeley or via Skype if you're not local. So yeah, that's a little bit about how to work with me. And all right. It is 12 o'clock, so out of respect for your time, we can end. Angela says, that was beautiful and informative. You're wonderful. Oh, thank you. That's very sweet. Does anyone else have any questions? All right. Awesome. So thank you so much for joining me today. It has been such a pleasure to share this information. Please feel free to be in touch. I will send you a follow-up email with all of the slides. And yeah, I hope that this information was sincerely useful for you in your life. All right, and wishing you all the best.